Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first in our webinar series. My name is Hatton. I'm from Sudan by nationality, and for the fourth year now, I have the privilege of serving as Dean here at African Leadership Academy. I'm sure all of you are familiar, but very briefly, I'll just say that African Leadership Academy was established 12 years ago on a simple premise, which is that leadership potential is evenly distributed across all Africans, but opportunities to demonstrate that potential and to translate it into impact are not. And what we try to do here at ALA is to identify, develop, and connect a generation of ethical and effective leaders who can work together to solve the continent's most pressing problems and achieve lasting peace and shared prosperity. It's very clear in the last few months what the most pressing danger or risk to that lasting peace and shared prosperity is. And as we all work towards a productive future that will come after this pandemic has passed, it's important that we ask useful questions and generate insights from experts who can help us understand this world that we are entering and plan for it well. And so in that spirit, and in the spirit of social distancing, we thought we might be able to leverage our wonderful network and this great new technology to convene a few conversations with speakers who know a great deal more than we do about the topics that we should explore. And so tonight is the first of those series, and we will be hearing from one of ALA's founders on the question of COVID-19 and its impact on the continent's economy. But before we go to our speaker for the day, I'd like to introduce our host. So Samantha Nyakundi is a second-year student here at African Leadership Academy. She is the leader of the African Leadership Academy Model African Union, and she will be our host for today, introducing our guest. Very briefly, I want to say that just as this crisis was unfolding, and as leaders across the continent were making difficult decisions, Samantha was a leader that I had the chance to observe firsthand wrestling with this topic. Just 1 week before the conference, which she and her team had been preparing for a full year, we were confronted with the question of whether or not we could responsibly convene almost 300 young people for a full week simulation of the African Union. And before President Ramaphosa made his pronouncements changing the law about gatherings larger than 100 people, Samantha and her team made the decision to cancel that conference. And I was humbled by that bold decision on that difficult evening. The world has come a long way, even in those short few 3 weeks. And so I look forward to learning more tonight together with all of you from Samantha and from our co-founder, Mr. Acha Leke. I'll pass over now to Samantha, who will do our introductions.
Thank you, Dean Hatton, for that introduction. It is a great pleasure to both participate in this panel with our guest and also to welcome you all to this webinar. I would like to start by guiding us through some of the functions we will be using for the webinar. After the speaker's presentation, we will be having a Q&A session. We will be using the Q&A function, the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to pose questions about the topic. Our speaker for today will be addressing as many as he can after his presentation. If you do have any general questions about African Leadership Academy, please email info@africanleadershipacademy.org. So let's get right into it. Today's topic, as Dean Hatton already mentioned, is based off McKinsey and Company's recent report on tackling COVID-19 in Africa, a topic that we're all surely affected by and concerned about. It is an absolute honor to introduce ALA's very own, Mr. Acha Leke. In a fundamental sense, he needs no introduction, so I'll be very brief. He is the co-founder of African Leadership Academy, a member of ALA's Global Advisory Council, and a senior partner of McKinsey and Company. I wouldn't take any more time. Against this broad background, I would now like to hand over to Mr. Acha Leke. Thank you.
Thanks, Hatton and Samantha, for that introduction. I hope everybody can hear me. I will just share my screen here. The plan is to probably take 15-20 minutes and just take you through some pages around the COVID situation and the economic impact, but use most of the time for Q&A, because we think that's most helpful and most relevant. So first thing is to say, we spent the last 2.5 weeks really analyzing this. Many of our team members have barely slept. It's a big issue. And we really wanted to get a sense for the size. How big could this be on the continent? How bad of a crisis are we talking about? But also start to think about what government should do, what the private sector should do, what our development partners should do, what citizens, what we all should do to help address this, right? And we released a report last week. Hopefully most of you have seen it. If not, we'll make sure you get it. We're continuing to do analysis. We have another report coming out next week, which I will talk about as well. But first and foremost, we need to recognize that it is a humanitarian crisis. It's a global one, right? And so hopefully everybody is safe and locked down somewhere and social distancing and all of that, and that your families are safe and that our entire ALA, broader ALA community is safe and sound. Having said that, 3 things I'll touch on briefly. One is where the epidemic is today. Secondly is the impact that it could have on Africa. And third, start talking about what players are doing, the stakeholders are doing, but what they should do more. And our overall message is people are starting to do stuff, right? So governments are doing, coming together. We've seen some fiscal stimulus packages. The development partners are contributing. We're all playing a role. But we believe people are completely underestimating the potential impact of this crisis on the continent. And we believe that much more bold action and much more urgent action is needed if we're going to address it, right? So that's the overall key message. Where are we globally? You know, 1.4 million cases, over 80,000 deaths. You probably are watching the news as much as we are, so I guess all of that you're probably aware of. There were big questions about the virus relative to the flu. You know, it's definitely more dangerous than the flu. What's more relevant, I think, is if we start talking about Africa. Where are we in Africa? So we update this every day based on the Africa CDC data. So this morning we had about 11,500 cases. This time last year was about half of that. Last week was about half of that. So it's actually growing quite fast. You see, you know, we have more than 1,000 cases in South Africa, in Morocco, in Algeria, in Egypt. Countries like Cameroon are already in the top 5. And if you look on the right, you'll see how we're tracking relative to Europe. We're tracking actually quite below Europe. And now there are a number of questions around that. People are talking about, as you know, the BCG vaccine, whether it helps, about the climate, about our population distribution. You know, we are the youngest continent in the world. But one of the facts that we know is we're not testing enough. It's very, very clear, right? To give you a sense, Nigeria has probably done less than 2,000-3,000 tests. Last I looked, South Africa has done over 50,000 tests, right? And Nigeria has more than 3 times as many people as South Africa. So we're not testing enough across the continent. So it's hard to really get with fact-based, but at least from what's been the data out there that's being released every day, this is where we stand. What does that then mean and the impact it has on the continent? We looked at it from a number of dimensions. We first, we modeled 4 scenarios, and I'll come back and explain those scenarios. We then looked at 6 drivers into that model, right? We actually modeled in detail 5 countries that account for about half of Africa's GDP. So we modeled South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Morocco, and Angola. We are in the middle of modeling other countries, so we're just about to finish modeling Ghana. We're doing Uganda and Rwanda. We're doing Egypt. We're going to kick off Cote d'Ivoire. So, you know, we're continuing modeling it, but I think that roughly we're getting a sense for where we're going to end up, right? And then we extrapolate it to the rest of the continent. This model does not include things like currency depreciation. It doesn't include things like all the fiscal stimulus packages the governments have announced. It, at the time, did not include the South Africa downgrade, but now we've included it, and we're updating it as we speak on a regular basis. Now, starting with the scenarios, we have, as you can imagine, on one axis, you know, what's happening with the virus globally. On the other axis, it's what's happening with the virus in Africa, and you can then see it 2 by 2, right? On the bottom left, you know, the best case scenario is the virus is contained in Europe and in the US, like it has been in parts of Asia. In Africa, we also find a way to contain it, right? Leveraging all the lessons we learned from Ebola and the support we're getting, but we find a way to contain it. All the way to the worst case, which is the virus. There's a resurgence of this virus in China. US and Europe struggled to contain it, and then we have a widespread epidemic across Africa. and then we have the 2 cases in between. We always talk about the corona, the COVID-19 crisis in Africa. The reality is the continent is facing 3 crises, right? In 2016, we faced 1 crisis, which was the oil impact, and we saw the oil crisis, and we saw the impact it had in many of our oil exporting economies. We're actually facing 3 crises today. One is the global pandemic, and that is manifests itself in terms of the disruption of supply chains for those of you in sort of the manufacturing sector. For many of our countries, I was actually surprised to realize that, more than half of our intermediary inputs into our final products that we import come from China, right? So that's gotten disrupted. There's also a reduction in demand globally for our exports. So for our exporting countries like a Morocco, like a South Africa, like a Kenya, for certain products as well, there's a slower demand for that. And then of course, reduced investment into the continent, as you can imagine. Then there's a second crisis, which is the Africa crisis. So limited movement of people, and that has a massive impact on tourism, the aviation sector, the tourism sector has been decimated on the continent. A number of our countries have tourism in those countries account for, call it somewhere between 8 and 12% of GDP. So, whether it's Rwanda, Morocco, South Africa, Kenya. So that's a big impact. The ways of working, with the sort of lockdowns, the partial lockdowns, the national lockdowns, the curfews, and as a result of that, and also with people starting to lose their jobs, as we're starting to see, reduce disposable income, so reduce household expenditure and reduce business expenditure. And that's a big lever, by the way. We'll come back to that in terms of impact. And of course, oil. So oil, oil prices at 30 or around there today. That, as you can imagine, has a fundamental impact for oil exporters like in Nigeria, like in Angola, like in Algeria. It actually has a positive impact for oil importing countries, right? So those are the drivers. When you pull all that together, this is where we came out from our modeling. There's only one scenario under which we believe Africa as a continent is going to experience positive growth this year. And honestly, that scenario we think is actually less and less likely, right? If you look at how the virus is spreading across Africa. Under the other 3 scenarios, we're going to experience a recession. So I think it's very likely, if you ask me today, that as a continent, we're going to go into a recession in 2020. And this is just for 2020. About half of that is due to the Africa pandemic. So half of it is really because of the reduced household expenditures and business expenditures, mainly because people are not spending and people are losing their jobs, and we'll come back to that. About 30% of that is due to the global pandemic. So this is the lower exports, reduced exports, and the supply chain disruptions. And about 20% of that is due to oil, right? And you can imagine that mix changes by country. So if you look at Nigeria, we believe that under any scenario, Nigeria is unfortunately going to go into a recession this year. Under any scenario, 70% of that in scenario 1 is really oil, is really driven by oil. But as if this continues and it's widespread in Nigeria, you can then imagine that you can understand that a big component of that big drop, as you can see, down to sort of -9% as we predict in scenario 4. A big component of that is reduction in household expenditure and the business expenditure. If you look at South Africa, again, under any scenario, we think South Africa is going to go into a recession. We've actually now, this model includes the impact of the downgrade. Moody's recently downgraded South Africa. So this includes the impact of the downgrade. Depends on, how you think about it. Again, what is this due to? Manufacturing exports slowing down, is due to tourism, the sector being decimated, is due to reduction in household and business expenditure. If you look at some of the other projections, people typically think that, South Africa is doing a decent job, and people are commenting on the good job it's doing in terms of managing the crisis, right? And if they do that, then you could see them ending up somewhere between scenario 1 and 2. And so if you look at some other projections, Fitch has a projection of -3.8. Some other local banks have projections of -4.5. So we think, potentially if we're able to manage the crisis here, somewhere between -2.5 and -5 is where we'll end up in South Africa, but still in a recession. We look at Kenya, it's a bit different here. We think there are 2 scenarios under which it's probably, still experiences a slightly positive growth. Again, the baseline you have 5.2. These are all, by the way, AFDB numbers for the baseline. It used to be 5.8, so 5.2 is post-locust, the locust invasion, so they had already adjusted the growth rate down to 5.2. but we see two other scenarios under which Kenya goes into a recession, right? Again, here, imagine it's due to household expenditure, it's due to tourism, it's due to, horticulture, exports declining, but that's roughly it is. So, and by the way, we're serving many governments around the continent on these topics and really helping them understand this and understand the implications of this. Now, let's talk a bit about some of the mitigating measures that we're seeing different stakeholders put in place, and then happy to wait for Q&A. So first, as any crisis, we're going through the process from a resolve all the way to a return and to a reform, right? So we're seeing many of our clients right now are focusing on resolve and resilience. So how do I really just address the crisis? And some are starting to think about, this crisis is going to pass. So how do I think about returning to what we call the next normal? But also, what can I do? It's affecting me, but also there may be some opportunities here, right? So what are these opportunities that are arising from this crisis, and how do I take advantage of them? As we think about it, the reality is Africa, we have some unique challenges to Africa, but also to many of the developing countries. Look at our fiscal capacity, our revenues to GDP are low, right? Only for our government, only 19% revenue to GDP versus you look at it 30% in Brazil. So we're actually not generating enough revenue. Then we take 22% of that revenue to pay off debt, right? To give you a sense, in 2020 alone, African governments would have to pay off $44 billion in debt servicing, right, to multilateral and bilateral partners, right? And that's a big deal, right? And we don't have the $2 trillion that the US has to pump into the economy, right? So this is where development partners have to step in to really help us. And we're starting to see that. You may have seen the ministers of finance have done this big request of a $100 billion type package. We actually believe it's not big enough, right? And many people are starting to say it may not be big enough for what we need to address this crisis, but at least we need the development partners, and we need some foundation and philanthropic partners to step up and help us here. Second, our economies are informal, and so 80% of our employment is with SMEs, and those are the most vulnerable parts or segments, as you can imagine, right? They don't, it's harder for them to sustain this crisis than it is for large businesses. So whatever package we put in place, how do we make sure that it actually reaches the informal parts of the SMEs, right? And also the informal parts of the economy. Third is the demographics, right? Young and in many cases poor, right? So we are the fastest growing urbanizing region in the world, but many people in urban centers live in slums, right? And like somebody reminded me, he said, when you live in a shack with 6 other people, self-isolation is actually when you leave your house. It's not when you stay at home, right? And so how do you think about these quarantine methods? There's big debates now about the health crisis versus the economic crisis, and how do you balance the two, right? You'll have a 10% chance of catching corona, but 100% chance of dying of hunger, right? And how do you deal with that? So these are some fundamental decisions that our governments are having to make, right? On the go, by the way, right? So we're helping them think about that as well. And then also, as we think about the long-term measures of impact of some of these measures, right? There's a lot of data which says that when schools close for a long time, it's harder for girls to come back to school, right? And so what are the implications of that? So we need to start thinking about some of these long-term measures. And then finally, our healthcare system, on a good day, it's fragile, right? Imagine now with these crises, and how do you quickly scale it up to address the needs? And here again, we don't have data. Like nobody has data today on how many ventilators we have at a continent, right? So, we hear Central African Republic may have 3, we hear Nigeria may have, a few hundred at best, right? But nobody has the data. As we start to think about, how many more do we need? How do we get them, right? Because they're not get squeezed out of the market. So, how many healthcare workers, what do we need? What is the capacity of the system to manage how this crisis may evolve, right? So really, how do we scale that? So those are some of the challenges the continent faces. Within that, what are people doing? We believe all the stakeholders have to come together. And the good news is they are starting to come together to address it. Governments are doing certain things. We think they need to do a lot more. The development partners are coming to the table. We again think they can do a lot more. Citizens, are there, but we actually believe we're not, in many of our countries, we're not taking it as seriously as we should. And then the private sector in some countries are starting to come together. We would like to see more of it. So the message is, again, across all of these dimensions, people are doing stuff, but we think there's a lot more bold and a lot more urgent action that is needed. And I'll talk you very quickly through each of the stakeholders, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Governments, really the 5 things they're doing, and they're all doing elements of it, right? Setting up the nerve center, so all the governments we're talking to, they've set up a nerve center, there's somebody leading it. they're coordinating, it's working better in some places than in others, but there's a nurse center that's set up. Now, beyond that, the 4 things they need to work on. One is the health crisis, right? And so here it's how do you get testing kits? What is your testing strategy? Who do you test? What happens? How do you trace? And how well do you do it? And there we're seeing countries, where, there's a big variation in the quality of that, right? And so that we need to get under control, and also preparing the health ecosystem to address the crisis. The second is food supply. This is where we just started to talk about it. At the beginning, it was really focused on health, and people realized when we do these lockdowns, how do we get food, especially, the essential commodities, and also the pricing of that, right? So how do you make sure that, that there's no price gouging around that, and how do you track it? So that's a big area of focus. And also the essential services they need to maintain, whether it's telecom, utilities, what are the essential services they need to maintain for the economy to continue to run. Then the third is about how do we protect our people. So the big question about protecting jobs, right? We predict, we're running the numbers now. We think, you could see sort of 10 to 20 million jobs losses, and that's just for the people who are salaried employees. For those who are non-salaried, it could be much bigger than that, right? So it's a big issue. And so the big question about how do you protect jobs, how do you support businesses, but not really just to support businesses just to support them. You really support them because you want them to be able to continue to employ the workers, right? But how do you do that is a big question that they're wrestling with. Then the most vulnerable part of the population, right? How do you make sure you actually help them? And this is a big issue because in many of our countries we don't have any social safety nets for these populations. And so how do you build one very quickly, and how do you get to them? So how do you reach them? Who are they? How do you reach them? What do you reach them with? Do you give them food hampers? Do you give them money? If you give them money, how much do you give it to? Do you give them? How do you give it digitally? And so there are a lot of questions here. So we're spending quite a bit of time thinking through what are the most effective methods to do that. And then finally, of course, the economy, right? So what do you do running the different scenarios? How deep of a hole is it in the economy? What can you do as government first to manage your expenses, right? We looked at the opportunity on public finance a few months ago. We said, look, there's a $100 billion opportunity for our governments, $50 billion on the revenue to raise more revenue, but the other $50 billion was on cost, right? So how do we tighten our belts as government? But even if we do that, there'll be a big hole across many of our countries, right? So then how do we get a stimulus package? How big of a stimulus package do we need? Some countries have announced stimulus packages. Roughly in Africa, they're about 1.5% to 4% of GDP. We believe we need 10%, right? So there's a gap, and where's that gap going to come from? But more importantly, even once you have that gap, how do you pump it back into the economy, right? So the big debates you may have heard about how we're asking for the $44 billion I spoke about. We're asking for a debt moratorium on that debt, right? On those repayments, so we can actually have that. Now the question is, what do you do if you have that money? What do you do with it, right? You want to make sure first you don't take it and go and pay off your private debt, right? The Euro bonds you raised in the private market. Also, is that what you go? That's probably not what you should do, right? But then how do you take it back and pump it back into the economy? But even if you give it to businesses, how do you make sure businesses use it for the right reasons, right? How do you make sure they use it not to pay up debt, but also to maintain the salaried workers and continue to pay them? So the real tricky questions like that governments are dealing with, and tough trade-offs to be made, by the way. And then finally, as you think about all of this, you also need to think about recovery, right? So how do you prepare for recovery? How do you reopen the economy, right? What sectors you reopen, what geographic areas you reopen when? Because you don't want that, you don't want to reopen too early, or you want them to get reinfected. So really thinking through that is actually so there's a lot that governments need to think about. Like I said, they're all thinking about some of these elements, but we need much more quick, much more urgent action on those dimensions. Secondly, for the private sector, for those of you in the private sector, I'm hoping you're doing many of these things, but we're all starting to work remotely, right? So thinking in a much more agile way of working. You can't take 2 to 3 months to make decisions. You have to make decisions very, very quickly. And in a very agile way. You all are not together anymore. People can't sign papers and bring it back for somebody else to sign. So how do you think about restructuring your governance model and your organization to deliver on that? And then the same thing for you, right? As you go through your companies, right? What is the nurse center? Who are the people who are going to meet every day to see how things are going? The first priority, of course, is protecting your workforce, right? How are they doing? Making sure they're safe, making sure they're not infected. If they get infected, how do you take care of them? Make sure they heal. Then it's the supply chain, where where are these goods coming from, and how do you make sure that that's solid? How do you continue to engage your customers in a remote way? One of my clients, I had a VC with them today, a telecom company, and they're thinking, how do our people used to come and buy airtime physically, right? How do you move everybody to digital, right? People used to call our call centers, but our call centers, you know, they're closed now. So how do we still make sure that the call center operators at home, that you can still reach them? Stress testing your financials, right? That's a big thing. You know, like somebody said, one of my clients said, you know, just like for individuals, you know, toilet paper is what we're hoarding. What businesses are hoarding is cash. So cash is the equivalent of toilet paper for businesses, right? So how do you make sure you have enough cash? And stress testing across our 4 scenarios, right? We tend to see people stress testing across 1 or 2 scenarios and a bit too scared. They don't believe the worst case could happen. Everything is very important to stress this across all of those scenarios. And then finally, but this is primarily for large private sector companies and business associations, is how are you stepping up to help the government, right, deal with this crisis? And we're seeing that a big step up in the private sector in South Africa. We're seeing a big step up in the private sector in Nigeria. We're not seeing enough of that across the rest of the continent. So we need the private sector to really step up across the entire continent to help businesses deal with this. And then finally, the development partners, you know, whether it's the World Bank and the IMF or some other bilateral partners, some of the foundations, we've seen some Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation step up significantly. We saw what Jack Ma did, providing test kits and masks to the continent, and now he's providing ventilators and some more. We've seen the MasterCard Foundation, come up with a big package that the board just recently approved to help deal with this crisis on the continent. So people are really starting to play a role. But again, there's more, right? So here what we're saying is, we really appreciate that, but there's a lot that needs to be done because, you know, it's a big gap. We need to protect jobs, protect our vulnerable people. And we just need to take it a lot more seriously. These are just some ideas that we've been debating and discussing with some of our private sector products of the development partners that we're talking to. And then I'll just end by saying, you know, at the end of the day, countries are trying to do, you know, with their own thing and trying to resolve it. But there's a group of Africans who've started to come together now and try to make sure we have an integrated Pan-African response, right? So how do we, as a continent, it doesn't help for every country to try to go buy 50 ventilators here and there because you're getting squeezed out of the market. How do we come together, understand the aggregate need for the continent, and then go and try to negotiate for that, right? So people like Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who was Minister of Finance in Nigeria, who chairs Gavi, the head of WHO, Dr. Tedros Kaberuka, who chairs the Global Fund, with John Kengasong, who's at the Africa CDC, and that's with people like Tijan Tiam and Strive Masiwa. So it's a group of 10 or 12 sort of African leaders who have come together. We have, you know, we have meetings every week, actually, VCs every week, to really figure out how do we play a much more integrated role, and what is the role of the AU, for example, in this? Who's going to go negotiate with China, right? And you know, we're starting to think about on the recovery plan to go to China and say, look, you know what, in some ways you caused this, so how can you actually help us? But you know, we can have different countries. It won't be as helpful to have different countries to do that. It's much more helpful if we go as one united Africa and have one African voice. So let me stop there. All I'll say is, you know, I'll just encourage you all to take it so much more seriously. We've been running some epidemiological models. If you look at the Imperial College ran a model for Africa. We ran some models that say, look, you know what, if we're not serious about taking this thing seriously, we can see millions of cases on the continent. We could see millions of cases on the continent. So it's very important for us to really take it seriously and all play a role in helping to address it. Let me stop there and happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Acha Leke, for that insightful presentation on the economic impact of the virus, more specifically on the African continent. I particularly liked the idea of an African Solidarity Fund for households that are more susceptible to the risks and effects of this virus. I would now like to turn to the audience for questions. Thank you to everyone who has submitted their questions thus far. We've taken note of them and we will be posing some of them to our speaker. Our first 2 questions come from ALA students. The first question states, the report emphasizes the role technology should play in not only alleviating the burden on healthcare systems on the continent, but improving the global response to infectious disease outbreaks. With regard to the farm's recommendation of governments partnering with private entities, how would real-time integrated tracking and analytics tools be developed and implemented in resource-constrained settings? The second question also states that according to reports by World Bank, it is said that sub-Saharan Africa could fall into its first recession in 25 years due to the COVID-19 outbreak. Is there anything that can be done to mitigate the financial impact, like currency devaluation or inflationary pressure as mentioned in the article?
Yeah, so I mean, on the first question, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot, and this is where you're seeing some of the innovation coming out of Africa, right? So, you know, For everybody that gets tested positive, you need to find how do you trace the different people they may have contacted. You can ask them who they saw and who they met with. There's a lot of innovation happening using cellular technology and all of that data to really do a better job of tracing, right? We saw that in Asia, and we're starting to see some startups here in Africa trying to develop that as well, right? We're seeing other startups trying to develop more on the medical side, helping you put in your kind of some of your symptoms and gives you a good sense for whether you should go to the hospital or not, so they can alleviate the burden on the hospital. So I do think there's if you start to take an opportunity lens here, there are a number of areas where there's an opportunity now, but also in the future, right? So if you think of what's going to happen, some things are going to change fundamentally across the continent, right? Some things are going to change fundamentally about how people operate, how people live their lives, right? I would say, I never have some clients in Abuja in Nigeria who I never thought would do a Zoom call because they needed to see me in person. Now we're Zooming, every week. And so that's going to change, how I operate, right? But within that, I think for interesting, tech startups, really thinking through what you can do now to address some of the challenges, right? So, but also, as we return to the next normal, how is that likely going to look like? And what role can you play? And it's going to be very tech-enabled, right? As we said, another opportunity is just digitizing all these businesses. And you can tell people are saying, this is going to force a lot more digitization across all of our sectors. So thinking through, what role can you play to help digitize businesses, whether it's private sector or on the government side. On mitigating financial barrier, we're very aligned with the World Bank, right? We actually think that there is and I did a podcast with the World Bank yesterday, actually, and we talked about this. We think there's a, very high likelihood that we'll get into recession as a continent, and we haven't had one in a very long time, indeed, as a continent. What can we do to mitigate it? I think is what we spoke about here. There's first a question around how much can countries do themselves, right? How much can they save to put back into the economy? The second is how much can they go raise, right? And that's going to have to be through development partners and through philanthropic organizations, right? But how big of that? How can you raise it? The third thing is now you have that money, then what do you do, right? So how do you get it to businesses and to support, again, to support employees? But also there's a thought about, are there some strategic industries as a sector, as a country you want to protect? Are there strategic companies, right? Does Ethiopia want to make sure they protect Ethiopian Airways, right? Does Kenya want to make sure they protect Kenya Airways or not, right? So there's fundamental questions that governments are going to have to deal with. Either way, there's a clear sense of we want to protect jobs, right? We're going to have tens of millions of job losses, right? How do you avoid that and how do you protect that? And then on the fourth element is the vulnerable population, right? How do you actually support them in this crisis? So I think those are all the mitigating factors that governments, one way or another, are looking at.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is from Larry Yon, and he asks, what industries will be growth sectors during and after COVID-19?
Industries that will be growth sectors. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I can tell you today, the industries that we see that are less affected, there are probably two today, right? There's the healthcare, right? And everything around healthcare, right? So like somebody told me in South Africa, everybody's could become a PPE manufacturer, right? So, I think the industries around healthcare and sort of these healthcare products, right? And the sort of the telecom industry, right? You can see if you talk to many of our telecom clients, they'll say, look, they can see voice a bit declining, but actually data is exploding, right? So for the telecom industry, those are ones that are probably less affected. They won't say they're not affected, that they're less affected. How will this play out? There are a number of questions, right? I do think that there will be a local manufacturing move, right? And you got to figure out what are we going to want to manufacture more locally. I think people are going to say, and this is globally, people are going to say we can't continue to just rely on China, Asia, wherever for some of these products, that we should just be manufacturing locally, right? So I think thinking through what are those kind of products, is it PPE, is it something else that we're going to manufacture more locally? If you look at the pharmaceutical industry, right, as regions close, right, a lot of the APIs that our pharmaceutical manufacturers were getting was coming from India, right? And now there's an export ban, right? So how do we start develop those locally? So I think you're going to see a lot more probably pharmaceutical manufacturing happening locally. And just thinking through what else could that be? Now the challenge is we can't have every single country now decide to go and manufacture their own pharmaceuticals, right? Too many of these will be subscale. So I'm also hoping that this would lead to two things. One is much more of an integrated Africa. So we realize that we're all very interdependent, and it will improve our our integration and allow us to speak more as one voice. But that will also help us have some of the tough conversations we haven't had, which is, let's say we want to build a manufacturing industry, but which country should manufacture what for whom, right? So it doesn't make sense for every single country to do the same thing. So really thinking through, because of your comparative advantage, because of your geographical positioning, does it make sense for you to manufacture, and then you can sell it to the rest of the continent, and what does it make sense for others to manufacture? Now we're not there yet, but I can see the conversation starting to happen, and so again, within all of those, I think there'll be quite a few opportunities for many players.
We also have a question from Elia Lam, Julia Paulino, and they ask, does this crisis present an opportunity for Africa to compete with China's stronghold on global supply chains?
Yeah, no, absolutely, right? I think that's what I was talking about, which is, at some point, we will start seeing some localization of the supply chain and some of the manufacturing. And then the question then is, as you become more competitive, then it's not just manufacturing for the continent, it could also be manufacturing for the world. So, I do think, some thinking around what are those sectors that would make sense to localize more, right? And then within that, how do I make sure I become competitive as a manufacturer so I can actually serve the rest of the world? The VC I was on just before this was with Dr. Orama from Afrexim Bank and a number of the private sector leaders in Africa, thinking exactly through that, thinking through, what we need to manufacture PPE, we can't buy any in China, all these masks, it's hard to get it. It's not that hard to do, right? So let's quickly identify companies in Africa who can do that, right? And, Afrexim Bank is saying, look, we'll be happy to sort of get into an agreement with them, provide them with funding to do it, right? So you're starting to see a lot of that kind of conversations happening. And I think you're going to see more of that over time.
The next question from the audience, from Salma. How do you think governments and us as citizens trying to hold governments accountable can achieve balance between taking strict measures and sorry, I seem to have lost the question.
Sorry, Sam, I moved it to the answered column. That's my mistake.
Oh, great. Sorry.
Can you keep balance between taking strict measures, example, extreme lockdowns, collecting data to track citizens, versus making sure that governments don't hold on to these newly acquired powers post the crisis?
Yeah. No, I think the two questions, I think there's a big debate around what measures are most appropriate if you want to balance health and the economy, right? So clearly a lot of measures we put in place initially was to sort the health crisis, right? Because you don't get it out of control. Now there's a lot of talk around, are there ways to balance the two? And that's actually the research we're doing now for our report next week. And it's not easy, right? So, we've actually, if you look at we've actually have an Excel spreadsheet I was looking at today with all the countries and what measures we've all taken. So there are a few that have gone to a full national lockdown, like South Africa, right? Full national lockdown, but that's about 5 to 8. Everybody has sort of closed schools and closed sort of religious gathering, limited gatherings. So everybody's done that. But there's a lot in between, right? Some have done curfews, right? Some have restricted partial lockdowns in certain regions. Look at what Kenya has done. You look at what Nigeria has done. So people are sort of everywhere in that spectrum. Now, I think people are starting to recognize, and it's not just in Africa, in Latin America, in India, that full national lockdown has a devastating impact on the economy, right? It may be the quickest way to flatten the curve, but it has a devastating impact on the economy. So the question then is, how do you balance those two, right? And the jury is out, and people are saying, even when you have full lockdown, you're starting to see people are talking civil unrest. You're starting to see, increased security risk because people just can't eat, right? Numbers I heard of 40% of Africans live hand to mouth every day. So, if they don't work one day, they just don't have anything to eat, right? And so it's actually not an easy answer, and governments are trying to tread carefully and trying to figure out what the right balance is, right? We'll have to figure out over time and learn for the next crisis, because there will be another one, but learn for the next crisis. Now, do I think governments are gonna, hold on to that? I do think there will be some liberties. I think we're giving people access to data, right? That they'll need to address this crisis. Are they gonna then, turn back and say, no, we're not gonna use that data anymore? I don't know. But I think for now, if we just focus on the crisis itself, there's a big question that we all need to answer, or help our governments answer, and they need to answer, which is about how do I balance resolving, managing, addressing the health crisis while managing the economic crisis, right? Don't know the answer yet. And by the way, that's when you're dealing with the crisis. The second question is also, how do you reopen the economy, right? Let's assume you say, okay, fine, the curve is starting to flatten. Do you just reopen like the entire economy? Do you reopen certain sectors, right? How do you make sure they don't get reinfected, right? So, we'll look at micro segmentation. This geography we think is green, so there's no infections, let's reopen it. But then how do you make sure that nobody infected comes back into that geography and reinfects it, right? Or this cluster, or this sector, right? So it's actually not straightforward, and it is dilemmas and debates that the government and the private sector are going to have to deal with. But to answer your question directly, so I think we'll see some of these strict measures, and it's important. And by the way, it's important for us to respect it as citizens, right? But hopefully over time we'll find the right balance.
Right. The next question has been a point of contention over the past few weeks. The member of the audience asks, what about the French announcement of testing new vaccines in Africa? What is Africa's position on that?
I mean, I don't know if Africa, I think there's been not enough people who've expressed horror at this, and I think Dr. Tedros said it best, right? The way he articulated it. And by the way, I think it's not just Africans. I think a lot of the world has come against them and said this is completely unacceptable, right? So I think that's a position. I think it was completely unacceptable for them to say something like that, and WHO has been very clear that they're not going to do that, right? So I think that's the position.
Azimpoleli asks, here in South Africa, the question is, how do you balance the economic imperatives with having to contain the virus? Some have suggested that in South Africa, we miscalculated by going for a lockdown when the virus had not really taken hold. What is your sense?
I mean, there's no real answer, right? Because the other issue, if you didn't go for a lockdown and the virus, really was widespread, that'll be another issue. The question is really the big debates around, yes, Africa, we have a younger population, so we'll sort of develop herd immunity and we'll be fine. If we just make sure we protect the elderly, and then the younger folks, we get it, and then we'll be okay, right? Now, the issue, if you're a government, you say, look, the challenge is our health system, like I said, are fragile at best, right? So we look at what's happening in New York, right? We have very much lower capacity than some of those, even those boroughs, right, in our countries. And so if you imagine a situation where even if we said, okay, let's open things up, and you have, quite a few people dying, and it's very visible, right? And the hospitals cannot manage that, and it gets completely out of control, you can imagine sort of the backlash you're going to have. So I think governments are actually trying to be quite careful. I think, South Africa, I think they made, a tough decision, but I think it was a bold decision to say, look, what, this is one way, let's try to stem it quickly and then try to reopen. Let's see, the numbers are showing that, it slowed down from where we were when it started at the beginning. Let's see how that is maintained. And I think it'll actually be a good test case for the rest of Africa as well to say, is that the right way to go? Now, it's clearly come at the expense of the economy. There's no question about that, right? And it'll be interesting, I live in South Africa, and I'm in Joburg right now, so we have another week of it, right? I spent 2 weeks at home, and it's been difficult, right? But for me, it's been absolutely the right thing to do. So again, I think there's some conceptual theories, and everybody has an opinion, right, around this. I think the proof is going to be in the pudding. What people are clear on is national lockdowns, or very robust lockdowns, are very good for the health system. They're quite bad for the economy, right? And so the question is more, how do you balance the two?
Okay, we have a question from Joseph Munyabanza, and he says, thank you, Acha, for giving us a sense of how this will affect Africa. He has 2 questions. What can the youth do, especially young entrepreneurs, SMEs, to protect their ventures, build resilience? B, what can the youth do to help their communities and countries to prevent the worst case scenarios?
Yeah, I think those are great questions, Joseph. Again, on what you can do, it's funny, I had a chat with the Anzisha fellows yesterday, and I was like, the issue is the most affected are going to be the SMEs. There's no question about it, right? So what can you do? I think you should really do the stress testing and figure out, how much money you have. I think you should be very aware of all the different programs that governments are putting in place. So they are putting in place programs to say, look, what, we'll lend you some money, we'll help you, and there's quite some support program. Many governments have announced it. So be very aware of these programs and make sure you apply for them, right? Because you will definitely need them. I do think trying to figure out, so that's what I would say you should do to protect and figure out who can help you as you go through this crisis, and who are your supporters or some of your funders who can actually help you bridge the gap, because there will clearly be a gap. On the other hand, to your point on what you can do to help, I think we can all play a role to respect whatever decision our governments are making around these measures, right? So I think social distancing, is absolutely critical. So let's make sure we all abide by that, regardless of what our governments have announced. That's one. Two is, I think the other role that the SMEs can do is also start to think through how can you help either deal with the crisis or even recover from it. So we talked about some of the business opportunities that may exist. Reflect on what are you doing today, and how can you help. And the third thing is also, when we talk about governments helping companies, what can we all do? I don't think it's SMEs. What can we all do to help our neighbors, right? We'll all be surrounded by people who are less fortunate than us, who are more vulnerable than us. What can we all do to help support them, right? So those are the few ideas I'll have for you.
We have a question from Alex Maza. He asks, the ACFTA will come into force shortly. It's clear that much of the economic impact of COVID-19 is related to a decrease in demand for African exports from external trade partners. How do you see COVID-19 impacting intra-African trade in the short, medium, and long term?
I actually think it could be positive, right? I actually think, I think back to this whole idea of, I think we'll come out of this crisis recognizing the increased need for a united Africa. And AFCTA fits right into that, right? So my sense is, as we start to think about more local supply chain and local manufacturing for the rest of the continent, that will help increase our intra-Africa trade, right? I don't know what the numbers, this is what, 15-16%, right? We've been talking about how we need to grow that for a long time, and we haven't really made a massive dent. So I do think somewhere in this crisis, if you think of, somebody says, never waste a good crisis, right? I think there's some positive things that are going to come out for the continent in this front. So practically on the AFCTA front, I think it will reinforce it. I think we'll recognize that first we're stronger when we talk in one voice as a continent, right? That's more on the political side, but also on the economic side. And secondly, thinking through what are the local supply chains that we should develop on the continent to serve as a continent, and you'll see more of that.
Okay, thank you. I'll now hand over to Dean Hatton.
Thanks, Sam. Acha, don't go anywhere. I can't, I have no chance of answering any of these questions anywhere nearly as capably as you've been doing. I am flabbergasted by your facility with the facts and the numbers. I'm just jumping in to answer two quick questions that are ALA centric, and then we'll go back to you if that's all right. So someone asked, very concerned, will ALA be canceled this year? Will ALA still be recruiting a class? And I want to jump in very emphatically and say no.
Oh, I thought you were asking me to answer that question.
No. I'm going to respond to the question. No, ALA will not be canceled. We are still recruiting our class of 2020, whom we are still hoping to have on campus by September. But of course, we recognize the situation is changing very quickly, and it might be sometime later than that, but there will be a new class for ALA recruited in 2020. And then the second question is, what are ALA students doing to respond to this crisis? And I think the answer to that is we haven't done enough yet. We've really been focused on getting ready to move to online learning. We've been in online learning for 2 weeks now. Tomorrow a break will begin and there'll be some rest and an arrival in the new normal. And I do hope that we'll see some initiatives led by ALA students in the coming days where they can, here locally in South Africa or around the continent, do some of their role as leaders to respond to this crisis, whether it's spreading knowledge or solving technology problems. So that's my two quick answers. I'm sorry to interrupt the flow of information that's coming from Dr. Leke, and we'll go back over to you, Sam, so you can ask the next question.
Thanks, Dean Hatton. So the next question in the Q&A session, for a country like Nigeria, what is the solution to the lockdown? The number of families that have barely enough to eat is over 40%. What should the government do?
I think that's a great question. The answer is, so we don't know yet. I personally don't know yet. We're looking at that actively. But it's very clear that there are a couple of things that need to be done, right? It's very clear that you need to protect the areas that are not infected, because you don't want those areas to be infected at all, right? So I think the states, the regions that are not affected, you have to make sure you protect them, whether it's not allowing anybody from the infected areas in or out. You need to protect those areas. So I think that's clear, right? Then you come to areas where there's infection, right? And the thing is, you don't want, because it's an exponential growth curve, right? So you don't want this to start to get to a point where it just grows exponentially, right? And so what we've seen people do is, we're going to try sort of some gradual measures, and then let's try, but then it continues to grow exponentially, and they're like, oh my gosh, now we need to do a lockdown, right? So the question is, what do you do in these regions? I think when there are really huge numbers of infections, you have to go a lockdown. You have to take that and do a lockdown. Now the question is, can you do more micro segmentation? So, okay, this is an area where we're going to do a real lockdown and resolve it there while keeping the rest of the other areas open. You can try to do that, but then once it starts to get widespread in the city, then it's very difficult, right? It's very difficult to say we're just going to do micro segmentation, right? Then you have to do a lockdown in the city, unless your option is to say, look, you know what, we're going to let it spread, right? Some people are going to die. Some people say, look, at the end of the day, malaria probably kills more people than whatever this is going to kill in Africa. So it happens, and and let that happen, and they will survive, won't kill the economy. That's a choice that people are going to have to decide which choice they want to make. But it's very clear that you need to protect the areas that are not infected, right? You need to manage the ones that have low levels of infection, right? And try to stem the growth of the infections there, right? And then you need to make a call on, do you use more of the, it's going to happen, let's let it be, or use more of the let's be more, more robust measures in place to address it. And again, I think everywhere, people are criticizing South Africa, people are criticizing Nigeria that they're not doing enough, right? So, you'll find people who have different views on this, right? At the end of the day, I think it's very clear that if we do nothing, from the models you see at Imperial College, your models we're seeing that we're running ourselves from our epidemiological model, it's always hard for me to say that term, is the one that Governor Cuomo is using in New York, so we've adapted to Africa. And again, like I said, this is one where if we don't do much, right, we'll be into the millions of cases on the continent, just to give you a sense.
Okay, we'll take questions for another 2 minutes. We have a question from Tin. He states that there is a view that the disruption to international supply chains has highlighted to African politicians' need to be self-sufficient in manufacturing of essentials. For example, food, medicines, etc. Do you see this resulting in a focus on local content manufacturing post the COVID crisis?
Yeah, I think we spoke a bit about that, right? So yes, I think that we'll definitely see more local manufacturing, local supply chains. We got to figure out which commodities, right? So I think as you all think of opportunities for you, which ones do you think will be much more necessary to do locally than to rely on exports or imports from China or from wherever else, right? But we're definitely going to see a trend around the world, by the way. It's not just in Africa, right? I think we're going to see a trend of sort of more local manufacturers of some of these commodities. And for me, it's two questions there. It's, how do we make sure that we do it at a Pan-Africa level, so not every single country wants to manufacture everything for themselves, because everything will be subscale, and it won't be the productivity is going to be low and the prices are going to be high. So we got to try to figure it out at a Pan-Africa level. And second is, how do we try to think about it, not just manufacturing for Africa, but also manufacturing for the rest of the world?
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we are getting close to the end of the webinar. Apologies to those whose questions you could not get around to. Thank you all for your participation in the discussion. Most importantly, thank you, Mr. Acha Leke, for the excellent insights into the questions that were raised. I would now like to hand over to Ms. Kalalelo, the coordinator of the Executive Seminar Series at A-Link.
So can I just say one last thing before we go? Because for me, this message around, please, we all need to take this incredibly seriously, right? I just think across the continent, too many people are too lax about this crisis, right? We need to take it incredibly seriously. And we all have a role to play to help stem it, because if not, we're going to see millions and millions of people infected in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leke. Thank you to Sam as well. You've handled the Q&A session so smoothly. I'm very proud of you, so thank you for that. Hi everyone, my name is Khalalelo from South Africa. And amongst many other things that I do here at ALA, I'm the coordinator for the executive speaker seminars, such as the one that we've had tonight. So firstly, I'd like to thank once again Mr. Leke for your presentation tonight. I think I speak for myself and really everybody who's joined that it was very insightful. And it's really that much more special when it's one of our own who's presenting. So it's so memorable for us tonight. Again, thank you to Sam for handling the Q&A session. And really for the hundreds who have joined us tonight, thank you for joining us. We hope that this presentation was useful and insightful and informative for you. And I'd really like to extend the invitation to everyone who is with us tonight. I can see there's hundreds of us tonight. If you do have recommendations for an amazing speaker or an industry expert that you believe would be available and willing to engage with the ALA community, please do send your recommendations over to us via email at info@africanleadershipacademy.org. That's info@africanleadershipacademy.org. But otherwise, for myself and the rest of the ALA team, that's it for tonight. This is the closing of the session. Stay safe and good night.
Night.
Bye.